Something has changed in you, and at first, it doesn't feel like a problem. If anything, it feels like relief. You're calmer now, less reactive. Things that used to pull you in don't seem to reach you the same way anymore. And for a while, that almost feels like growth, like you've finally learned how to protect your energy. But then, something subtle starts to feel different. Not wrong exactly, but unfamiliar. Because some of the things that used to affect you deeply don't seem to affect you at all anymore. And in the quiet that follows, a question begins to form. Should that worry you? Because if you look closely, this didn't start now. You've been here before, more times than you can count, trying to understand what someone meant, reading between the lines, replaying the same conversation in your head, wondering if you said too much or not enough, wondering if you were misunderstood. And most of the time, you felt responsible for fixing it, fixing the tension, fixing the silence, fixing how you were perceived, because something in you believed that if you just explained yourself clearly enough, everything would settle. But it never really did. It just kept repeating. Different people, same pattern, the same emotional weight, showing up in different forms. And maybe that's why this change feels so unfamiliar. Because now, you're not stepping into that cycle anymore. You're not rushing to explain. You're not trying to be understood at any cost. And the silence that once felt uncomfortable now feels like a choice. But when something like this begins to shift, it can feel confusing, because part of you still remembers who you used to be. It didn't happen all at once. There was no clear moment where everything changed. If anything, it started in places so small, you almost didn't notice them. A message you didn't feel the urgency to answer. You saw it, and chose not to enter. A conversation that ended, and, for once, didn't follow you for the rest of the day. You went back to your routine, and realized your mind wasn't trying to replay it. And that's when something subtle begins to shift. Not in what's happening, but in how much of it reaches you. And that was new. Because before, it never stopped there. One moment would turn into hours of reflection, trying to understand what was said, what was meant, what you could have done differently. But now, something interrupts that pattern. Not forcefully, just naturally. As if your mind no longer feels responsible for carrying everything that happens around you. And that's when you begin to notice that it's not just your reactions that are changing. It's your relationship with those reactions. You don't feel the same need to immediately respond, to clarify, to make sure everything is understood. There's a pause now, but it's not the kind of pause that comes from hesitation or doubt. It's the kind that comes from distance, a quiet space between what happens and how deeply it reaches you. And inside that space, something begins to dissolve. The tension, the urgency, the constant sense that you have to manage how things unfold. And for a while, that absence can feel confusing because you were used to being deeply involved, emotionally present in every detail, carrying more than what was ever asked of you. But now, that weight doesn't attach itself the same way. And even though nothing outside has really changed, your experience of it has. And this is where most people get it wrong. Because from the outside, it might look like you're becoming distant, less responsive, less emotionally available. But what's actually happening is that you're no longer holding on to everything that used to pull you in. And this is where something deeper begins to reveal itself. Because what feels like distance isn't distance at all. It's a shift in how you relate to yourself. Carl Jung believed that much of what we call reaction isn't really about the present moment. It's shaped by patterns that have been building for years. It's like you were carrying a lens, one that quietly colored everything the same way. Every silence meant something. Every tension needed resolution. Every distance had to be understood. And for a long time, you didn't question that lens. You just lived through it. But now, something is shifting. That lens is no longer fixed in place. And most of the time, those patterns didn't start with you. They were learned. In the way people around you handled emotion. In the way silence was interpreted. In the way tension was resolved. Or avoided. Maybe you grew up in an environment where being understood required explanation. Where clarity didn't come naturally. So you learned to anticipate it. To read between the lines. To sense what wasn't being said. And slowly, that became part of how you moved through the world. Not just with family, but with friends, with relationships, with every interaction that followed. Emotional imprints, unresolved experiences, parts of you that learned, at some point, that staying alert, staying involved, staying affected, was necessary, and for a long time, it was. It helped you navigate complex emotions. It helped you stay connected. It helped you understand people, even when they couldn't fully understand themselves. But over time, that same sensitivity can turn into something heavier, a constant readiness, a tendency to absorb more than what truly belongs to you. And that's where the shift you're experiencing starts to make sense. Because according to Jung, real psychological change doesn't happen when the world becomes easier, but when your inner relationship with it changes, when something inside you no longer reacts automatically, no longer feels the need to interpret everything through the same lens. This is what he described as a movement toward integration, not the loss of emotion, but the end of unconscious reaction. And that's an important distinction, because from the outside, it might look like you're becoming indifferent, but what's actually happening is far more precise than that. You're becoming selective, more aware of where your energy goes, more conscious of what you allow to affect you, and less driven by the need to immediately respond to everything. In Jungian terms, this is the beginning of stepping out of automatic patterns and into a more integrated sense of self, a place where your reactions are no longer controlled by what hasn't been processed yet, but guided by something more stable, something quieter, something that doesn't need to prove itself in every interaction. And the moment this shift becomes real is not just when you feel it inside you. It's when other people start responding to it, sometimes in ways you didn't expect, because the way you show up now is different. You're not as quick to respond. You don't fill every silence. You don't explain yourself the way you used to. And even if you don't say anything about it, people can feel it. You notice it in small moments. Someone says something that would have pulled you in before, and instead of reacting, you just nod and let it pass. Some will notice it as calm, a kind of grounded presence that wasn't there before. Conversations with you feel lighter, less reactive, less emotionally charged, and without realizing it, they begin to respect that, because there's something about someone who doesn't need to prove themselves in every interaction that naturally creates space. But not everyone experiences it that way. For some people, this change is uncomfortable because they were used to a version of you that was always available, always responsive, always willing to engage, even when it cost you energy. And when that version of you begins to fade, they feel it as distance, as disconnection, sometimes even as rejection, not because you've changed against them, but because you've stopped overextending yourself to maintain what was never balanced. And this is where misunderstandings begin. You may hear things like, "You've changed. You're different now. You don't care like you used to." And part of you might question it. Wonder if maybe they are right. Because from the outside, it does look like a withdrawal. But what they don't see is that this isn't about pulling away. It's about no longer abandoning yourself to stay connected to others. It's about not forcing presence where it doesn't happen naturally. It's about allowing silence without trying to control what it means. And that changes the entire dynamic. Because now, your presence is no longer driven by effort. It's driven by choice. You engage when it feels real. You respond when it feels aligned. And you step back when something doesn't require your energy. And whether people understand it or not, they adjust to it. Some come closer because they feel the stability in you. Others step away because they no longer find the same access they once had. And slowly, your environment begins to reorganize itself around who you are now, instead of who you used to be. And this is where the shift deepens. And this is where something becomes undeniable. Because at a certain point, you realize this isn't just a phase. It's not something you're trying to maintain. It's not a technique. It's not even a decision anymore. It's the way you see things now. And once that changes, it's very difficult to go back. Not because you're forcing yourself to stay this way, but because the old way no longer makes sense. You start to notice things you didn't notice before. Not in others, but in yourself. The moments where you used to overextend. The situations where you tried to maintain something that wasn't mutual. The subtle ways you adjusted yourself just to keep a sense of connection. And now, when you see those patterns, you can't unsee them. You can't unknow what you've already understood. And that changes your relationship with everything around you, because awareness has a consequence. Once you see clearly, participation becomes a choice, and that choice creates distance between who you were and who you are becoming. Not a dramatic distance, not something that separates you from the world, but something more subtle, more internal, a shift in what feels natural to you, what you tolerate, what you engage with, what you no longer feel the need to hold together. And with that, something else begins to settle, a kind of internal stability that isn't easily disturbed, not because nothing affects you anymore, but because you're no longer defined by what does. And this is where the real change happens, not in how the world treats you, but in how little it takes from you, because what once pulled you in no longer has the same access, and what once required your attention now passes without leaving a mark. And in that, there is a kind of quiet clarity, the understanding that you don't need to engage with everything that reaches you, that not every emotion needs to be processed in depth, that not every connection needs to be maintained, and most importantly, that your sense of self is no longer built around how you are perceived by others. And once that foundation shifts, everything built on top of it begins to change as well. And this is the part most people are not prepared for. And this is the part people rarely talk about. Because not every inner shift feels empowering at first. Some of them feel like grief. Not because something valuable was lost, but because something familiar is no longer there. The version of you who immediately responded. The version of you who kept trying. The version of you who felt responsible for holding everything together. For a long time, that version of you felt like love, like care, like depth, like identity. So when it begins to fade, you don't just feel relief. You also feel the absence of someone you have been for a very long time. And for a moment, you may even question yourself. Wonder if you're becoming distant, less caring, less emotionally present, because the intensity is gone. And for so long, you associated intensity with meaning, with connection, with depth. But now, without that urgency, you're left with something unfamiliar, a quieter way of being that doesn't rely on emotional pressure to feel real. And that can be disorienting, because growth is not always experienced as expansion in the beginning. Sometimes it is first experienced as emptiness, a silence where urgency used to live, a pause where anxiety used to move, a strange calm in places where your old identity once rushed into act. And that calm can feel unfamiliar at first, not peaceful in the way you imagined, but empty in a way you don't quite know how to name, because for so long, your sense of presence was tied to movement, to thinking, to feeling, to doing something with what you felt. And now, without that constant internal activity, there's a quiet space where your identity used to be reinforced, a space where you're no longer reacting, but not yet fully used to simply being. And that in-between can feel like uncertainty, like something is missing, when in reality, something unnecessary has finally stopped. And if you don't understand what's happening, you may be tempted to undo it, to go back to over-explaining, to go back to over-giving, to go back to being the version of yourself that feels more recognizable to others, and even to you. But that is often the moment when something essential is being asked of you, not to perform the old self, just because it feels familiar. Carl Jung understood that individuation is not only the discovery of who you are, it is also the painful separation from what you are not anymore. And that separation can feel lonely, because the old ways of relating, the old emotional reflexes, the old forms of self-abandonment once gave you a certain kind of belonging, even when they hurt you. So this stage is not just about peace. It is also about mourning the self that survived, by staying available, mourning the self that searched for safety, in being understood, mourning the self that believed closeness had to be earned through emotional labor. And the deeper truth is this: you are not grieving because you are becoming less. You are grieving because you can feel that an old form of identity no longer fits the life growing inside you. But then something else begins to change. And once this becomes real inside you, another truth begins to emerge. Not every relationship can follow you into this version of yourself. Some connections were built around your old patterns, around your availability, around your tendency to explain more, give more, remain longer, and carry more than your share. And when those patterns begin to dissolve, the relationship itself can start to feel different, not necessarily because the other person changed, but because the structure underneath it did. There are relationships that feel close only because one person keeps compensating for what is missing. One person keeps clarifying. One person keeps softening the tension. One person keeps returning emotionally after every rupture. And when that person stops doing it, the truth of the connection becomes visible. You begin to see what was mutual and what was maintained, what flowed naturally, and what depended on your effort to survive. And that clarity, while quiet, changes everything. This is why inner change can feel so disruptive. It reveals what effort was hiding. It reveals what imbalance was being maintained by your willingness to overfunction. And not everyone welcomes that revelation. Some people will call it distance. Others will call it pride. Others will say you've become harder to reach. But often what they are really feeling is the loss of access to the version of you that was easier to pull. And this is one of the hardest lessons to accept. Some relationships do not become deeper. When you become healthier, they become thinner, because they were never built on mutual depth to begin with. They were built on your adaptation, on your sensitivity, on your willingness to bridge the distance, even when no one met you halfway. And once you see that clearly, you begin to understand why this stage requires courage. Because it is one thing to change inwardly. It is another thing entirely to let your relationships reorganize around that change, to stop rescuing the dynamic, to stop reviving what only survives. When you betray your own peace, to let silence reveal what effort used to conceal. And yet this is where a more honest life begins. Not everyone will stay. Not everyone will understand. But what remains has a chance to become real. And this is where it becomes irreversible. After enough of this, something quieter begins to form. Not a performance of strength, not emotional armor, not the need to appear unbothered, but a more grounded relationship with yourself. You begin to understand that peace is not the absence of feeling. It is the absence of inner self-betrayal. It is what remains when you stop negotiating your well-being for approval, access, or emotional reassurance. And this is where Jung's vision becomes deeply practical. Individuation is not a mystical idea, reserved for rare moments of insight. It shows up in ordinary life, in what you no longer chase, in what you no longer explain, in the conversations you let end, in the tensions you refuse to inherit, in the growing ability to remain with yourself, even when someone misunderstands you. This is a different kind of strength, one that does not need witnesses, one that does not need immediate resolution, one that can tolerate ambiguity without rushing to repair it. And maybe that is why it feels so different from the old ways of coping, because the old strength was effort. This one is alignment. The old strength was endurance. This one is discernment. The old strength kept you in patterns, long after they stopped nourishing you. This one lets you leave, without turning your departure into a war. And that may be the clearest sign of all, that something profound has changed. You are no longer trying to win, where your soul has already outgrown the game. So if you've been feeling this shift, this strange calm, this quiet distance between what happens and what reaches you, don't rush to call it coldness, and don't assume you are losing your depth just because you are no longer giving it away so easily, because something else may be happening, something far more subtle and far more honest. Imagine, for a moment, that your energy has always been like water, flowing outward, filling every space it touched, adapting to every shape, every person, every situation, and for a long time, that felt like connection, like presence. You're not someone who reacts less. You're someone who no longer needs to. And once you see that clearly, you begin to understand something even deeper. It was never about controlling your reactions. It was about no longer needing to abandon yourself in order to have them.